Once upon a time in an African town named Gma, there lived a young girl named Lima. Lima was as sharp as a needle. Though she was just 9 years old, her mind was quick, her hands were busy, and her smile was like the first rain after a long dry season. Everyone in the town said this girl was no ordinary child. Her father, Gwa, loved her more than words could say. My princess, he often called her, feeling his voice resonate like a drumbeat. Lima was the star of her school, always coming home with marks that made her father's chest swell. You will be great, my daughter, Gwa would say, patting her head. When Lima turned 14, Gwa knew she was ready for more. He enrolled her in secondary school, even though she was younger than the others. You will learn and soar higher than the birds, he told her. But Gwa was a trader, always traveling to faraway lands to buy and sell goods. He could not stay long at home, so he hired a lesson teacher, Mr. Marco. Teach my daughter well, he said, handing him the task. Mr. Marco came often, his face strict like the harmattan wind. At first, he seemed like a good teacher, helping Lima with her books. But while Gwa was away, things were not perfect at home. Lima's mother, Salma, was as beautiful as a peacock, but her heart seemed far from home. Salma loved to dress in fine clothes, paint her face like the rising sun, and dance the nights away at parties. She left the house early, her perfume trailing behind her like a whisper, and returned only when the moon was tired of shining. Lima longed for her mother's care, her warmth, just a moment to talk, but Salma never stayed still long enough to notice. Her laughter and chatter were always reserved for the parties she loved, leaving her daughter behind in a house that felt too big and too quiet. One night, Lima sat in the small living room, her heart heavy with a secret she had to share. She heard the ticking of the clock, each sound like a hammer on her chest. She had prepared herself, whispering, "Tonight I'll tell her. She'll listen this time." As the hours passed and the shadows grew longer, Lima's eyes began to close. But she had to stay awake. She filled a small basin with icy water and dipped her feet inside, the chill biting her skin. It was her way of fighting sleep, of holding on to hope. But the night turned into morning, and Salma still hadn't come home. Lima's heart sank, heavy as a stone dropped into a deep well. When the first rays of sunlight kissed the earth, Lima rose quickly and went straight to her mother's room, determined to speak. But the bed was empty, the covers untouched. Salma was gone again. Tears welled in Lima's eyes, but she blinked them away. Maybe next time, she told herself, her voice trembling. And so the day began with Lima carrying the weight of her untold words like a bird forced to fly with broken wings. One warm afternoon, the air in Gma town felt heavy, as if it carried a secret no one wanted to tell. Mr. Marco arrived at Lima's house for her usual lesson. His face was strict as always, and he carried his books, but behind his glasses, his eyes held something darker. The house was still, with no sound but the scratch of chalk on paper and the occasional creak of a chair. Mr. Marco sat across from Lima, watching her as she solved the problems he had given. After a while, he asked casually, "Is your mother home?" Lima, without looking up, shook her head. "No, sir. She went out." Mr. Marco smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was like the grin of a hyena stalking its prey. "Let's take a break," he said, standing up. Lima followed him into the kitchen, thinking he wanted to eat. But as she reached for a bowl, she heard the soft click of the door locking. Her heart jumped, and she turned to see Mr. Marco standing close behind her. "Mr. M," she began, her voice trembling. Instead of answering, he reached out and grabbed her arm. His hands were rough, and his touch made her skin crawl. "Don't scream," he whispered, his voice sharp like a knife. "If you tell anyone, I'll make sure you fail all your exams. They'll send you away from school." And just like that, he forcefully assaulted her without anyone knowing. Tears spilled from Lima's eyes, but her voice stayed trapped in her throat. Mr. Marco touched her where he shouldn't. His hands felt like the claws of a monster. She felt frozen, like a small bird caught in a hawk's grip. When he was done, he stepped back, straightened his shirt, and said, "Go and get me some food." His voice was calm, as if nothing had happened. If you've made it this far, I encourage you to like and subscribe to the channel to continue enjoying fascinating content like this. Your support is very important to us. Lima's hand shook as she served him. When he finished eating, he stood and said, "Remember, not a word to anyone." Then he left, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. That night, Salma came home earlier than usual. Her face was tired, but Lima didn't care. She ran to her mother's room, her heart pounding like a drum. "Mama, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "What is it?" Salma asked, her voice sharp and impatient. "It's about the lesson, teacher." Before Lima could finish, Salma cut her off. "Don't start making excuses. You just don't want to study, do you? Always looking for a way to be lazy." "But Mama..." "Enough," Salma snapped, brushing her daughter aside as she went to her room. Lima stood there, her words swallowed by her mother's anger. She felt smaller than ever, like a bird trapped in a cage with no one to hear its song. That night, she cried herself to sleep, her pillow wet with tears and her heart heavy with silence. Lima's world became dark, like a stormy sky with no sunlight. She carried a heavy burden, one too big for her small shoulders. At school, her once bright mind became clouded. She stared blankly at the blackboard, unable to focus. Her teachers called her name, but she barely heard them. At night, she cried silently, her pillow soaked with tears. Her body grew thinner, her laughter disappeared, and her eyes, once sparkling, were now dull. The joy that used to fill her heart was gone, replaced by fear and sadness. Mr. Marco, the lesson teacher, continued to visit. Each time, his presence felt like a dark shadow creeping into the house. He would smile his fake smile, act as if nothing was wrong, and then wait for the moment they were alone. "Mama doesn't believe me," she thought, her chest tied with sorrow. "I wish Papa would come home." She dreamed of her father's warm hugs and the way he called her "my princess." She hoped, prayed, and waited, but the days dragged on, and Gua was still away. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple as Gua returned from his long journey. His steps were tired, but his heart was full of joy to see his family again. As he approached the house, he heard noises coming from inside, screams, faint but filled with fear. Gua froze for a moment. "Salma," he called, thinking his wife might be in trouble. He dropped his bags and rushed toward the door, bursting into the house. What he saw made his blood boil. Mr. Marco was on top of his daughter, Lima, forcing himself on her. Her face was wet with tears, her hands pushing weakly against him. "Lima!" Gua roared, his voice shaking the walls. Mr. Marco turned, his face pale as if he had seen a ghost. He scrambled to his feet, panicked like a cornered rat. Seeing Gua's rage, he dashed toward the window in a desperate attempt to escape. "Stop him!" Gua shouted, but before anyone could move, Mr. Marco leapt through the window. The night air was filled with the sickening sound of his body hitting the ground hard, followed by a loud cry of pain. Gua ran outside and found Mr. Marco sprawled on the ground, his leg twisted at an odd angle. He was writhing in pain, unable to move. Gua grabbed him by the collar, lifting him like a sack of grain. "You dare touch my daughter!" Gua growled, his voice low and dangerous, his face clenched as he shook the man. "Please forgive me," Mr. Marco whimpered, his voice trembling. "I thought no one would know. There's never anyone at home. I took advantage." His words hit Gua like a slap. The weight of his absence, of leaving Lima unprotected, crashed over him like a tidal wave. Tears filled Gua's eyes, but his anger did not waver. He dragged Mr. Marco back into the house, his mind set on one thing, making the man pay for what he had done. Inside, Lima sat trembling in a corner, her small frame shaking with sobs. "It's over, my daughter," Gua said, his voice softer now as he knelt beside her. "I am here. No one will hurt you again." But the fire of Gua's rage was not yet extinguished. He looked at Mr. Marco, still groaning in pain, and knew the man's punishment had only just begun. Gua's fury burned hotter than the midday sun as he dragged Mr. Marco through the dusty streets of GMA town. The man's broken leg dragged limply behind him, and he whimpered in pain, but Gua's grip never loosened. People peeked out of their homes, their eyes widening at the sight. I hope you enjoyed this amazing trip. Subscribe and don't miss our next video. See you next time.